past and move on from here. Thank you.
Senator van Turnhout.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, and I very much welcome you to the House, and I welcome our opportunity as a House and as a Seanad to have this important debate. In fact, the Irish Times quoted this morning from the most recent CSO survey on income and living conditions in Ireland, and that the gap between richest and poorest in Ireland grew by more than 25% in 2010. And the at-risk of poverty rate actually rose from 14.1% in 2009 to 15.8% in 2010. And obviously, I expect that trend has continued in 2011. So with that backdrop, I think it's appropriate that I start addressing my statement today of housing concerns, I think, of two very vulnerable groups historically in Irish society, that is the long-term homeless and people with disabilities. Because Minister, as you know, these housing concerns have been long known to successive governments. They were never solved in the boom time, and I'm greatly concerned that their very specific needs will be further sidelined now that the housing crisis is affecting the general population so seriously. In regard to homelessness, Minister, Focus Ireland has estimated that as many as 5,000 people are homeless in Ireland at any one time. Of that, 1,500 children are homeless each year. A quarter of these are under 12. The previous government had a target to end long-term homelessness by the end of 2010. Unfortunately, that wasn't achieved. I feel really strongly about the need to end long-term homelessness, not only just because of the social justice imperative, but in the best interests of homeless children, but also it actually saves money for the Exchequer, because when you start looking at the figures, it's estimated that it costs 30,000 a year for a bed in emergency accommodation versus as little as 14,500 even in Dublin to provide a home. According to the current policy, it's not deemed unacceptable for a person to be in emergency accommodation for up to 6 months. Now, for me, emergency, when I first came across the term emergency when I worked in Children's Rights Alliance, I was thinking 24 hours, 1 week. But this can go on for a much longer period. In fact, the majority of homeless people are in emergency accommodation for over 2 years, and some have been there for 10 years. There's 2,500 individuals in emergency accommodation in Dublin city centre alone, including 225 family households. And when we're talking emergency accommodation, certainly for the family households, we can be talking about B&Bs, for example. This means if you have a young baby, where are you bathing that baby? In a shower? You hear of children doing their homework on side of suitcases. The whole family structure breaks down. So it actually has quite a severe and detrimental effect. And by my calculations, Minister, if you took just those in emergency accommodation in Dublin, I moved in simplistic calculation, but you're talking 38 million. So I'm trying to struggle with the figures to understand why we continue to use emergency accommodation on such a long-term basis. I find it quite unacceptable. And I do welcome the current government's commitment in their programme to government to ending long-term homelessness and the need to sleep rough. And I understand in order to achieve this goal, in addition to the delivery of supports and services for individuals and families vulnerable to homelessness, 3,000 homes are required nationally to end long-term homelessness by 2013. So, Minister, given that only a few hundred homes have been delivered over the past 3 years by all local authorities and housing associations nationally, how are we going to deliver these 3,000 homes required? Also, Minister, my understanding is that Minister Phil Hogan announced in December last year that 2,000 units had been earmarked by NAMA to be available for social housing. I understand that that has now further progressed, and the department is currently looking at 400 to 500 as viable for purchase or lease. And can you provide us any information in this regard? And how many of these units will actually go to provide homes to people that are homeless? Regarding to housing policy for people with disabilities, the launch of the new housing strategy for people with disabilities is very much a welcome step. And there are a number of issues that need to be progressed, and I do hope that they will be progressed shortly, including the establishment of a housing and disability steering group in each local authority. Also, in terms of the supply of range of measures currently being deployed, do not always meet the needs of people with disabilities. For example, the rental accommodation scheme and lease properties are usually not suitable for people with physical disabilities. So, Minister, can you advise the House of the progress made with the strategy to date? That's particularly, for me, it's just of a concern that we do progress that. Regarding to the housing supply, Minister, and I have no doubt that colleagues have spoken before me and certainly after me, and I can see that Senator Hayden is going to be speaking, so will probably give much more expert advice than I will on this. But it has totally radically changed over the past 2 years, with a focus now on flexible measures, including long-term leasing. Okay, long-term leasing of accommodation. So, Minister, my concern is that in 2007 there was over 9,500 new social homes were provided in the state. In 2011 there was 3,500 to 4,000. So we can see that the demand is increasing, but the supply is clearly reducing. So I'm concerned about that. I do believe, Minister, that some of the voluntary and cooperative sector could provide a great resource to this. So, and I see you agreeing. So my question is, why is 62% of the resources allocated to social housing over the period 2012 to 2016 under the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Framework being directed to local authorities in the private sector when the majority of the new supply is expected to come from the voluntary and cooperative sector? So I don't understand why 62%. Minister, I have a lot more to ask you, but I'll just move on to my ending point about the unfinished housing estates, and others have said points. But one thing I came across recently was an estate, and I can provide you the details. It's an unfinished estate. There's about 25, 30 houses on it. 25 are finished, 5 are not finished. There's actually a house at each end of the estate is occupied, but the rest of the estate has been boarded off and is in security. There's a young man who's been employed to be a security for the estate. He sits in his car 14 hours a day outside the estate, which for me is just, even sitting an hour waiting for somebody in my car, I find I'm losing patience. So 14 hours shift in his car. But this young man, and I'm sure he's not alone, has 20 weeks left to complete his bricklaying apprenticeship. And he's looking in at those 5 unfinished houses. He can't emigrate because he hasn't got his apprenticeship. He's that close. 20 weeks, he could finish his apprenticeship that close. So it just, for me, doesn't make sense. And I'm absolutely sure he's not alone. So I just can't make sense of that we don't look and see. So that for me is, I'm sure it's not an isolated case. I will forward on to you, Minister, my other questions that I had, but I do greatly appreciate the opportunity for the debate we're having here. Thank you.
Senator Hayden.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. I'd like to also welcome the Minister.